I'm Rod Giltaca. I'm the CEO of the Canadian Coalition for Firearm Rights. The Canadian government is banning guns. But did they base their decision on real evidence? Or is the truth a lot different than Canadians think? We're about to find out. Good evening, and welcome to Gun Ban Canada Exposed. In this series, we examine the arguments used by the Liberal Party government to justify their controversial Bill C-71 and the massive May 1st gun ban. Tonight, we explore a central talking point used to convince Canadians to support the ban. The Liberals claim that the majority of crime guns seized by police are sourced domestically. What the government is continuing to try to do is convince Canadians that criminals are getting most of their guns by either stealing them from lawful gun owners or that licensed gun owners are legally buying guns and selling them to criminals, an activity known as straw purchasing. The government needs the public to believe this in order to take action not against criminals, but against licensed gun owners.
Can you tell us today where they come from? Do they come over the U.S. border? Do they come from elsewhere? Because it's illegal arms that are the problem.
The police in Surrey, British Columbia, and the police in Toronto, they would have said 3 to 5 years ago the major source was smuggling operations coming in from the United States. But they believe the nature of the source has changed, so that there is less smuggling in from the United States and more domestic sourcing of illegal weapons through, for example, break-ins that steal perfectly legal guns and put them into the black market in Canada. So the police have said the nature of the source is different now than it was 5 years ago.
So according to the government, criminals are getting their guns through theft and straw purchasing. We'll take a closer look at these two claims in a moment. But first, where did this information come from? And why hadn't we heard about this before? Columnist and editor at the National Post, Matt Gurney, wrote an article for Global News back in September 2018. It detailed how earlier that year, the Canadian press put out their own article suggesting that licensed gun owners were partly to blame for a surge in gun violence in Toronto because gangs were getting their crime guns from licensed gun owners. That's a serious claim. The story quoted Detective Rob D. Daniele of the Toronto Guns and Gangs Unit. The detective claimed that he was personally aware of, quote, more than 40 cases of straw purchasing in recent years, end quote. As it turned out, there was no evidence offered to support D. Daniele's claims, and a few months later, overwhelming evidence surfaced from the Toronto Police Service themselves, proving the opposite. Even the acting Chief of Police at the time, Mark Saunders, who had supported these claims, had to reverse course. Here's the worst part. The original story from the Canadian press was republished by the CBC, the National Post, CTV, Global News, and dozens of local newspapers. D. Daniele's claims were also cited in original articles by the Toronto Star and the Globe and Mail. As a result, unsuspecting Canadians likely believe that licensed gun owners are, in some part, to blame for gang-related gun violence. With the help of Canada's mainstream media, Ralph Goodale was now in the clear for his claims, and Bill C-71 was on its way through the House of Commons. But the misinformation about the majority of crime guns being domestically sourced didn't just come from the Toronto Police Service. A couple of years earlier, in 2016, Inspector Chris McBrien, then head of the Western Canada Division of NWest, the National Weapons Enforcement Team, all part of the RCMP, was quoted as saying, quote, "It is a fact that the majority of gun-related crimes in our communities are committed with guns that are domestically sourced," end quote. Evan Dyer of CBC News reported that when he asked the RCMP for data behind this definitive statement, the RCMP replied that no such data exists. Quote, Inspector McBrien's statement would have been based on information available to him at the time. However, this information would not have provided a complete national picture of the sources of crime guns, as no such data exists, end quote, says a statement from the RCMP. Sergeant Marie Damien goes on to say, quote, "Currently, there is no national repository for this type of information in Canada. The Canadian Firearms Program does not collect or track national statistics with regard to the origin of crime guns," end quote. So immediately, the foundation of the Liberal government's claim that somehow licensed gun owners are to blame for rising gun violence was collapsing. But the government pressed on regardless of its lack of evidence. We'll dig into those details when we come back. In order to justify increased regulation on licensed gun owners and later sweeping gun bans, the government needed to make a connection between licensed gun owners and criminals. Not easy. Despite a humiliating rejection of their wildly debunked claims, the Liberal government and Ralph Goodale pressed on. In an effort to find the truth, Conservative MP Larry Maguire filed an order paper question to find out if anyone really knows where crime guns are coming from.
My background is from a rural constituency here in southwest Manitoba. I have hunted in my area, taken the PAL and the RPAL license just because I wanted to be more familiar with what the government was doing. And so the government has made a big mistake here, and that's what's got my attention. I just feel that the government has looked at some of the crime statistics that have taken place and felt that it was a very good political move to let people know in the city that they thought they were trying to do something by banning all of these firearms. 70% of the firearms used in criminal situations in the city of Toronto in 2018, 70% of those firearms were illegally smuggled into the country. You can't even buy them here. And they're prohibitive to start with. So that's why I tabled my order paper question back in the spring to see if the government had any data to suggest that firearms are being used to commit crimes were being sourced through legal channels. And of course, the answer came back is they don't. I mean, it's just, we never got an answer from the government. It didn't surprise me too much that the Liberals didn't have any relevant information to get to the bottom of this question, because if they did, they would have released it in support of their legislation, such as the Bill C-71 that they had, and now reclassifying some 1,500 firearms as prohibited. So there's just a real shortage of data here. It is an order paper for a reason. If we ask the question live in question period and we don't feel we've had a fulsome answer, you can put an order paper question in a written form, and the government has to reply to that at some point. The federal Liberal government that we have today doesn't want to admit that it's criminals and gang members that are committing these heinous crimes with firearms, and they're not tackling the situation as directly as they should be.
So what have we learned? It's the middle of 2018, and the Liberal government is sounding the alarm about runaway gun violence in our communities. They're saying that it's because guns are being provided one way or another by licensed gun owners, and they have the solution. A pile of new regulation in the form of Bill C-71, and later with the sweeping May 1st gun ban. Despite their shocking inability to provide data to support this, and all the while being backstopped by the media, one Canadian continued to press the government for answers. Ex-RCMP member and well-known researcher Dennis Young filed an access to information request to the Toronto Police Service regarding tracing crime guns in 2018. The TPS responded, and as it turns out, there are a little bit of data around that examines the origin of crime guns, at least in Toronto. In short, in 2018, the Toronto police seized 833 crime guns. They could successfully trace about half of them, 57%, which is 475. Of those 475, they traced 70% of them directly to the United States and 30% to Canada. This is a very different story than what Ralph Goodale and now Minister of Public Safety Bill Blair have been telling us. But wait, it gets better. Have another look at this data. 25% of these guns are pellet guns and toy guns, a quarter of them. The other category can represent replicas and starter pistols, who knows, maybe even water guns. But the point is this, none of these things are actual guns. What are they doing on this list in the first place? To be clear, there are too many criminal shootings in Canada, absolutely. Should we be looking at ways to eliminate them? Of course. But is any of this a reasonable justification to take guns away from millions of Canadians who've done nothing but comply with the law? And don't we deserve better from those who are in charge and to whom we're paying good money to solve these problems? And do we deserve better from the media, for that matter? These are all good questions. When we come back, we'll have a close look at straw purchasing and the problem of stolen guns. So stay with us. No Canadian wants to find out that their firearms were used in a crime or worse, to hurt another person. And that does happen in Canada. Stolen firearms are a source of guns that end up in the wrong hands. So let's have a closer look at this problem. In his campaign to support Bill C-71, Ralph Goodale tweeted this message. First, he addresses the now discredited claim that domestically sourced firearms are the real problem in Canada. We know that they aren't. Then he characterizes the idea that firearms are smuggled into Canada, which they are, as a myth. Now pay close attention to how he words this, probably to avoid getting into trouble later. That the myth is that crime guns come from overseas. Has anyone ever mentioned that crime guns are coming from overseas? Has any police agency ever said that? That overseas crime gun smuggling is a source of guns in Canada? Now, interestingly, look at this graph. Apparently in 2008, almost no break-ins were committed for the purpose of stealing a firearm, but by 2016, they number around 1,400. How is that possible? One explanation might be that there's a change in the definition of breaking in specifically to steal a firearm. Think about that for a second. This chart refers to the intent of the criminal breaking in. How could the government know this information? In 2018, the Director General of StatCan was challenged on this claim in the Canadian Senate.
How do you determine that a break and enter has been committed in order to steal a firearm? How do you know that it's specifically to steal a weapon? There is a way in the Uniform Crime Reporting tool to determine this. There are data available to determine whether the gun was stolen during the B&E and was it for the purposes of selling for money. So we collect data in this tool. I'm a former police officer and I've seen a number of B&Es, and somebody goes in to steal jewelry and then they see the guns and they say, okay, I'm going to take those. They could be going for something else and just taking the weapons. Would this not falsify the statistics? What the statistics show is that there has been the theft of a weapon during a break and enter, and not that the initial intention was to steal a firearm.
So the senator asked if StatCan knows the intent of criminals when they break into someone's home. First, the Director General says yes. Then, unconvinced, because the senator knows better, he rephrases his question, and it turns out the real answer is no. Turns out they have no idea why criminals are breaking in. But yet, here's what the Minister of Public Safety is telling the public. This is clearly untrue information designed specifically to persuade uninformed Canadians to support a ban on guns, or at least as much new regulation as Ralph Goodale feels is appropriate. So it seems the position of the government is that the only way to stop criminals from stealing guns is to take them away from licensed gun owners first. Instead, some might argue that the government should stop criminals from breaking into our homes in the first place and stealing our things. Seems like the real problem is government is failing in its own responsibility to stop crime. Besides, if licensed gun owners are to blame for Canada's gun violence, why is it so difficult for the Liberal government to provide an honest case? It's a good question. When it comes to associating licensed gun owners with the acts of criminals, the topic of straw purchasing comes up.
Somebody with a legitimate firearms license, and they'll purchase it legally with the intention of then reselling it illegally.
3 SKS semi-automatic rifles, 1 prohibited magazine, 2 Uzi-like submachine guns.
And they'll purchase them legally for hundreds of dollars and then sell them for thousands of dollars. There's a lot of money in it for people.
If licensed gun owners are buying firearms and selling them to gangs, that's a problem at any level. And there have been some high-profile cases of that in the last few years. Keep in mind, there are 2.2 million licensed gun owners in Canada and thousands of so-called crime guns seized each year. So how often does straw purchasing happen in Canada? Using a combination of mainstream media reporting and case law search tools like Canley, 2 independent researchers could find no more than 44 examples of this happening in all of Canada between 2003 and 2020, an 18-year period. In fact, the first case ever in Alberta recently occurred in 2016. Justin Shipowitz, a licensed gun owner, purchased 40 firearms legally and sold them to unlicensed individuals in 2016. Quote, "This is a fairly novel criminal activity in Canada," end quote, said Crown Prosecutor Adam Garrett. Garrett said this case is the first of its kind in Alberta, though there have been a few similar offenses in Ontario and in British Columbia. So it seems this doesn't happen very often in Canada. The Alberta Crown Council said it themselves. And consider this question. Why would we be relying on independent researchers to determine the number of straw purchasing offenses in Canada in the first place? The answer is, no one is keeping track of them. Not the RCMP, not the Canadian Firearms Program, not NWest, not StatCan, nobody. To be fair, because gun owners want a safer Canada too, we need to acknowledge and honestly assess the problem of straw purchasing. It's reasonable to assume that far more people are committing these offenses than are actually getting caught. Let's think about this for a minute. As unlikely as it is, let's assume there are 10 times more licensed gun owners doing this than the 44 cases that we can find. That would total 440 licensed gun owners out of 2.2 million. This equates to less than 0.02% of gun owners engaging in this activity over an 18-year period. To be sure, one instance of straw purchasing is one too many. But is straw purchasing the problem that the Liberals say it is? Is it reason enough to ban guns? That's probably for you to decide. When we come back, we'll take one last look at how we got to this point. So stay with us. Welcome back. Let's go back to the beginning of this story. Bill C-71 and the massive May 1st gun ban was supported by the fact that the majority of so-called crime guns were now coming from domestic sources. We looked at in some detail the supposed epidemic of stolen guns and the overblown claims of straw purchasing. So what about the part that makes all of this relevant? That the origin of most crime guns are domestic. Statistics Canada is the preeminent source for crime data in our country. It's the most trusted source of information we have. The Director General of StatCan testified to the Canadian Senate in 2018 describing what they know about the origin of crime guns.
We still don't know the origin of firearms used during firearms-related crime in Canada. Are they coming from Canada or from the United States? Have they been stolen by somebody who owned them legally or illegally? Were they imported or purchased legally? We don't know. We also don't know if there is a tie between violent crime that is committed using firearms and organized crime. We don't know the implication or the involvement of organized crime in other types of crimes, not just firearm violent crime.
Apparently, no one really knows where these crime guns are coming from. Listen carefully to what the Director General said. It's not that StatCan is unsure about the information, they flat out don't know. Interestingly, while StatCan doesn't know, these people all seem to be certain and are already cheerleading new regulations and now total gun bans.
In 2006, 33% of those crime guns were sourced to Canadian owners, meaning they were at one time legally owned. It doesn't mean that the legal owners misused the guns. It simply means that at one time they were legally owned and registered in Canada. And we've seen that that has, over the last 3 years, been more than 50%. That's consistent with a study that was done in British Columbia and published in December 2018, which said historically most crime guns were smuggled into Canada from the U.S. Over the past 3 years in British Columbia, however, approximately 60% were sourced in Canada. So this is not restricted to Toronto.
If we've established anything in this episode, it's that some people claim that the evidence is clear and overwhelming and that the debate is over. But for Canadians who legally own and use firearms, the misrepresentation of evidence, the false claims, the government associating them with criminals and their crimes, is factually incorrect and it's morally wrong. Law-abiding Canadians own firearms for good and sufficient reasons. Private firearm ownership is nothing new in Canada. It's not a recent phenomenon. Citizens have owned guns for hundreds of years in our country, long before Confederation. I think most people would agree. The government should not be in the business of fooling Canadians into supporting a gun ban. It's not right, it's divisive, and it won't help the country. Next time on Gun Ban Canada Exposed, various experts tell us that the proliferation of firearms means more firearm-related violence. In short, more guns equal more death. We'll have a close look at this frequently used talking point and find out if it actually holds true. Thanks for joining me, and good night.
Standardizing this good business practice will help police trace guns used in crimes, detect straw purchasing schemes, and identify trafficking networks. Critically, the records will be privately owned by the retailer. They will not be accessible to government